The next morning, the Nile fog clings to the low fields like a damp curtain, and you're already awake, thanks to the unmistakable scent of goat in your courtyard. Not actual goats, just the neighbor's livestock wandering close again, reminding you that even in ancient Egypt, rural life means unpredictable animal cameos. Today, though, you're following a different trail, not goats, but ink. You're on your way to visit the village scribe, a slightly hunched fellow named Dedu, who always smells faintly of fish oil and crushed dates. He lives 2 doors down in a house cluttered with scrolls, broken reed pens, and jars sealed with waxy bits of linen. The Egyptian scribes were the memory keepers of the civilization, and without them, no one would have known who paid what, or in what form. You knock gently on the reed doorframe and are greeted by a bored grunt. Dedu waves you in with a charcoal-smudged hand. Inside, it's cozy and chaotic. Scrolls are stacked haphazardly in baskets, and he's working by the dim orange glow of an oil lamp, its base blackened from months of use. Papyrus strips are spread on a low table, weighted down with bits of limestone and empty perfume bottles. Clearly, he's already had a busy morning. You sit cross-legged on a reed mat as Dedu sighs and mutters about ink shortages and flaky taxpayers. He gestures to a small pile of recently collected goods, a jar of sesame oil, a wedge of dried fish, and of course a delicate alabaster vial containing what's allegedly myrrh, though it smells suspiciously like rancid goose fat. He dips his pen, a sliver of reed chewed to a perfect point, into a blob of soot-based ink. With delicate strokes, he starts listing each item into the village tax log. It's not fancy, just basic tallies of names, goods, and quantities. Still, it's meticulous. If Menka, the tax collector, is the hand, Dedu is the mind, keeping the entire bureaucracy stitched together with ink and passive aggression. Historians still argue whether scribes like Dedu operated entirely independently or were supervised by temple officials. The temple-state system in Egypt was a tangled web of religious and administrative duties, with priests, tax agents, and scribes often overlapping in their roles. What's certain, though, is that without these scribes, perfume taxes would have wafted away into the ether like so many burnt incense offerings. Dedu pauses in his work to sniff one of the jars. Lotus, he says, squinting, or maybe fermented fig. Hard to say these days. You ask if it still counts. He shrugs. If Menka accepts it, I write it down. That's the job. He's got a certain resignation to his tone, the voice of someone who spent decades cataloging the olfactory whims of an empire. One day it's almond oil from Nubia. The next, it's pressed safflower from a street vendor who swears it's royal grade. Nearby, a cat hops onto a stool and starts pawing at a roll of half-finished receipts. Dedu gently shoves it off without looking, like a man who's done this too many times to care. You can't help but chuckle. Even in antiquity, office cats are a thing. On the wall hangs a small shrine to Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing and wisdom. Dedu has left a dab of perfume at its base, a personal touch, maybe an offering to ensure he doesn't misspell sesame again like last week. Outside, the marketplace is beginning to stir. Voices rise and mingle with the sounds of chopping wood and clanging pots. But in here, it's just the soft scratch of pen on papyrus and the steady drip of oil in a lamp. You ask Dedu if anyone ever tries to cheat the perfume tax. He snorts. Every week. Last moon, someone tried to pass off mashed figs steeped in donkey sweat. Said it was a new blend. I nearly passed out. He grins, a rare moment of levity. The taxes are technically based on value, not volume. A small vial of top-tier myrrh could outvalue a whole jug of watered-down cinnamon oil. But measuring value in scent, That's tricky. Egypt had no unified perfume grading system. It came down to local knowledge, gossip, and how much the collector trusted your nose. Dedu finishes your business and rolls up the scroll with practiced ease. He ties it with a reed fiber string and tucks it into a basket with others. Next, he mutters, already moving on to the next entry. As you step outside, the sun's higher now, casting long shadows across the packed dirt path. The perfume tax, for all its peculiarity, is just another part of life. You glance back and see Dedu pouring a few drops of something amber-colored into a clay dish near the window. It steams slightly in the morning light. Maybe it's his own blend, a private indulgence in a world where even smells come with paperwork. Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into ancient Egypt, where the perfume flows like bureaucracy. And yes, you can be taxed on your signature scent. Picture this, you're waking up to a soft gray fog curling over the low fields of your Nile-side village. It's early, too early, and the air has that thick, earthy smell of morning dew mixed with goat. Not your goat, though. No, these are the neighbors' goats, or maybe just their scent wafting enthusiastically across the courtyard like an uninvited guest. You haven't even opened your eyes yet, and already you're regretting not sealing the doorway reed mat tighter last night. The village is still half asleep, the sun not quite over the horizon, and the only things truly awake are the animals and the occasional overachieving rooster who seems to have misunderstood the concept of sunrise. You stretch, sit up on your woven straw mat, and blink away dreams of date syrup and sand dunes. Today's going to be bureaucratic, because today you have to deal with your taxes. Not in silver or grain, oh no. You're paying in perfume. Yes, literal, aromatic, sometimes suspiciously gooey perfume. Welcome to one of the weirder corners of ancient Egyptian fiscal policy. You're part of a system where the government, in all its scribal wisdom, has decided that value can be measured by how good you smell. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step outside. The fog clings to your tunic like damp flour, and your sandals make that quiet shuf-shuf noise on the packed dirt path. It's not cold exactly, Egypt rarely is, but the mist gives the morning a chilly breath, like the Nile exhaling through its reeds. You adjust your scarf and sigh, staring down the empty lane where the fog makes even the closest palm trees look like ghostly shadows. And there it is again, the goat smell. You wrinkle your nose and glance around. The culprit isn't visible, but you know it's nearby, probably standing under your awning, eating your only surviving barley sprout. You make a mental note to reinforce the courtyard fence, or at least bribe the neighbor with honeyed figs to keep his livestock in check. But you have more pressing matters: perfume, tax day, which mean Dedu. Dedu, your village scribe, is the kind of man who looks like he's spent 30 years arguing with ink. He lives just a few doors down in a mud brick house that's perpetually filled with the aroma of stale papyrus and something faintly fishy, possibly literal fish. He's the one who logs everything the tax collector doesn't feel like remembering, which is everything. If Menka, the local tax agent, is the biceps of the operation, Dedu is the overworked, ink-stained brain. You're not even sure what's in your own offering jar. It was sold to you as a Lotus Blend base by a street vendor with too many teeth and not enough ethics, but it has that unmistakable undertone of fermented fig that no amount of optimism can mask. Still, it's sealed and tied with linen. Maybe it'll pass. The path to Dedu's place is quiet, except for the distant clatter of a pot being dropped and a child yelling something about stolen onions. The usual domestic chaos, just muffled by the fog. You clutch your little jar tightly, like someone walking into a temple of judgment, because that's kind of what Dedu's hut is, an altar to ink, taxes, and silent disapproval. When you reach his doorway, you knock lightly on the reed frame. A grunt answers you. That's about as much ceremony as you're going to get. You step inside, ducking under a dangling string of half-dried herbs and what might be desiccated lizard tails. His house is a cave of clutter, scrolls stacked in leaning towers, broken reed pens in clay jars, and one particularly angry-looking cat curled on a folded mat in the corner, judging everyone equally. Dedu doesn't look up as you enter. He just waves a charcoal-smudged hand toward the floor in that universal sit-there gesture. You lower yourself onto a reed mat, trying not to knock over anything sacred or unstable. The air is warm and humid, thick with the scent of oil lamps and old perfume residue. Somewhere under it all, the lingering trace of dried fish oil gnaws at your senses like a bad memory. He mutters something about another damn myrrh sample and shuffles a few papyrus strips around on the low table in front of him. Weighted down with smooth bits of limestone and the occasional reused perfume bottle, the table looks more like a perfumer's junk drawer than a tax ledger. Dedu, hunched and squinting, dips his reed pen into a dish of soot ink and gestures vaguely at your jar. You place it down gently. "This month's?" he asks, finally glancing at you with eyes that... You step back out into the soft light of the morning, the air still heavy with fog, but now warming ever so slightly under the first licks of sun sneaking over the thatched rooftops. The courtyard behind you fades into the mist, and Dedu's voice, already grumbling at the next taxpayer, becomes just another piece of the ambient morning murmur. You cradle your empty perfume jar like a relic, its linen wrapping slightly damp from his curious sniffing. You walk slowly, letting your sandals brush the dust like you're trying not to wake the earth beneath your feet. There's no rush now. The deed is done, the tax is logged. You, lucky sleeper, are not on Dedu's blacklist this month. That's better than a good omen. It's practically a luxury. The Nile's presence is always felt here. Even when it's not in view, its moisture clings to everything, curling papyrus scrolls and making the thatch droop in lazy arcs. The land near it is rich and dark, like someone stirred all the earth's flavor into one line of fertile black. And out there, beyond the mist, the real work of the day has already begun. Farmers are guiding wooden plows drawn by sleepy oxen. Children are herding geese that honk like drunk priests. And somewhere, someone is already sweating over an open fire trying to boil down something vaguely fragrant into something vaguely sellable. See, perfume wasn't just a luxury here. It was an industry. A seriously stinky, flower-murdering, oil-soaked trade that stretched across social classes and religious divides. Rich folks hoarded the good stuff, imported frankincense resin, crushed lotus petals, cedar wood oil from Lebanon. Poor folks. They got whatever was left after the good oils had been skimmed, plus a few creative blends involving goose fat and optimism. And yet, everyone paid taxes on it. Perfume was valuable, yes, but also oddly democratic. If you made it, traded it, bought it, or even owned more than your fair share, the state wanted its cut. The pharaoh's coffers needed filling, after all. Gold doesn't mine itself, and someone has to pay for those enormous stone tombs nobody uses until they're dead. Taxation in ancient Egypt was a strange and wonderful beast. It wasn't just about coins or grain. It included cattle, linen, beer, honey, and yes, perfume. Anything with value could be taxed. And perfume? It was value in a bottle. It didn't rot, well, not immediately. It smelled like power, and it had the magical ability to make people believe you were fancier than you really were. The Egyptians, of course, were obsessed with scent. Smell was not just cosmetic, it was divine. Priests bathed in fragrance before ceremonies. Offerings of perfumed oil were made to gods like Hathor, Isis, and Bastet. Even the dead were swaddled in perfume, spices, and oils to keep them sweet-smelling on their long journey to the afterlife. Basically, if you were going anywhere important, like the court, the temple, or the underworld, you needed to smell impressive. And if you didn't, well, good luck getting past the gods with your pit stains and goat funk. There's a reason the tombs are filled with alabaster jars labeled with names like Nubian musk or Kaifi blend. These weren't just souvenirs, they were part of your eternal luggage. No sandals, no snacks, but a full set of perfumes? Now that's afterlife readiness. Historians still argue whether perfume taxes were centrally recorded in temple registries, or if they were more like a loose set of notes scribbled by overworked scribes like Dedu. Some believe large temple complexes had designated perfume appraisers. Others suggest it was all local enforcement, based more on gossip and nose strength than on anything official. It's possible, for example, that your current Lotus blend was logged in one town as a high-grade fragrance, but in another, a suspicious smelling vial that got poured out behind the scribe's house. Egypt was unified, sure, but that didn't mean uniform. As you walk past a small bakery puffing out clouds of yeasty warmth, you hear two women arguing over whether the temple taxmen are sniffing perfume or drinking it. One insists hers was the good kind, even though the vendor filled it behind a curtain and labeled it "Trust Me Blend." You keep walking. You know better than to get involved in mid-morning market drama. That's how you end up losing an hour and a jar of pickled radish. You pass a shrine, a tiny one, tucked into the outer wall of someone's home. It's dedicated to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. Someone's dabbed a bit of oil at its base, a little dark circle on the limestone. Maybe it's an offering from a fellow taxpayer hoping for leniency. Or maybe it's from Dedu himself, sneaking in a few prayers that nobody brings him fig sweat again. Thoth was the protector of scribes, and honestly, they needed it. Scribes were the memory of Egypt. Every field measured, every ox counted, every drop of perfume assessed. It all went through them. You think, by the time you reach your front step again, the fog has finally surrendered to sunlight, pulling back like a curtain on a stage you didn't realize you were starring in. The packed dirt path is warm underfoot now, and from somewhere beyond the neighbor's wall comes the unmistakable honk of a goose in full existential crisis. You pour yourself a little dish of cool water, letting it catch the light, and sit down on the threshold, staring out at your little slice of rural bureaucracy. There's something soothing about watching the day roll in, like Egypt is one enormous living spreadsheet, constantly updating itself in smells and shadows. And if that's the case, then your life is just another neat row, a tidy little cell between the perfume taxes and the goose complaints. You glance again at your receipt, still tied with reed fiber. It's nothing special, just your name, the goods, a few scribbles in Dedu's precise, cranky hand, but it represents something much larger, a system, a web, 1,000 people across 1,000 villages, all sniffing, scribbling, bottling, and bartering their way through the Nile's unblinking seasons. So how exactly did it all work? Let's zoom out for a second. Ancient Egypt's taxation system was not as simple as give us 10% or face the jackals. It was layered, seasonal, and very, very personal. Taxation was based less on standardized monetary value and more on productivity, meaning how much you grew, harvested, brewed, or distilled dictated how much you owed. If your barley crop flourished, great, cough it up. If your goats mysteriously stopped producing milk, also fine, but prepare to part with that suspiciously fragrant oil you keep under your bed. Tax time wasn't just once a year either. It moved with the flood. The Nile's cycle, inundation, growth, harvest, was the real calendar. Tax officials, known charmingly as collectors of the two lands, would swoop in post-harvest to assess your goods and sniff your oils. And yes, some of them were trained noses. Others just pretended. Some, legend has it, were completely nose-blind and just went with whatever Dadu wrote down. Historians still argue whether these collectors were chosen for their loyalty to the temple state or for their ability to hold their breath in poorly ventilated storerooms. Some records suggest local priests oversaw the assessments, ensuring fairness. Others hint that corruption was as inevitable as heat stroke in linen. Because here's the thing, perfume wasn't just taxed for fun. It played a key role in temple rituals, funerary practices, and public health. In temples, sacred blends were used in daily rites. 3 times a day, the statues of gods were cleansed and anointed with specific oils. If the priests ran out, the rite stopped. So if your taxes included a vial of lotus-infused oil, congratulations. You were now part of the divine supply chain. Even the embalmers relied on perfumed oils to prepare bodies for the afterlife. The Book of the Dead might get all the press, but in reality, a decent sandalwood blend was just as essential. Nobody wanted to arrive in the field of reeds smelling like pickled onions. But back to your humble village. There are no pyramids here, no towering obelisks or painted tombs, just mud brick homes, courtyards, and the occasional goat trying to chew someone's tax paperwork. And yet, it all connects. Dedu's ink flows into the same bureaucracy that once dictated the perfume allowances for queens. It's the same ink that ensured temples received their monthly oil rations, the same ink that confirmed whether you were a good citizen or someone who needed a visit from the slightly too eager collector with halitosis and a fondness for back taxes. You stretch your legs. The warmth is seeping into the soles of your feet now, and a little breeze carries in the scent of someone nearby crushing mint. That's a hopeful smell, refreshing. You wonder if that's what they're offering the gods today, or maybe they're just tired of goose stink. Either way, it's a reminder that fragrance was always on the edge of sacred and survival. A good perfume could elevate you. A bad one? Well, it could get you taxed and mocked in equal measure. Now let's pause here for a fringe theory you'll love. Some archaeologists believe certain high-end perfumes were actually encoded with secret recipes, passed only between elite perfume makers under temple sanction. These were guarded as tightly as royal secrets. You didn't just stumble across the right blend, you had to inherit it, be trained for it, or steal it. There's one tantalizing bit of graffiti on a wall near the ruins of a perfume workshop that reads, "I took her oil, and now the goddess follows me." Poetic? Definitely. Legally actionable? Maybe. Nobody knows what happened to the thief or the oil. And just when you're chuckling about divine stalkers with exquisite taste, a neighbor stops by your doorway with a small clay dish. It holds something. The breeze dies down again, and the day settles into its late morning rhythm, the time when the smells of the village start to stack on top of each other, like the world's weirdest casserole. Someone's roasting lentils, someone else is crushing fenugreek, and 3 houses over, you're pretty sure a batch of linseed oil just caught fire. This is the hour when rural Egypt starts to hum, not in song, but in simmering pots, bleeding animals, and the constant shuffling of feet and baskets. You're heading back toward Dadu's place, but not for more tax business. You've got questions. You want to know what really happens to your bottle of not quite lotus oil once it leaves your hands. Is it blessed? Burned? Bottled again and sold to some overly perfumed priest in Thebes? Dadu's reed curtain is halfway closed. You knock twice. No answer. You knock again and hear a grunt, followed by something shattering. "Don't step on that," he mutters before you've even entered. Inside, the scroll chaos has multiplied. Dadu is knee-deep in what looks like someone's shipment of linen, scrolls, and what might generously be called experimental ointments. One of the jars has leaked. It smells like fermented onion dipped in regret. "So," you say casually, "where does my perfume go after you log it?" Dadu glances up. "You want the real answer, or the temple-approved one?" You don't even respond. He knows which one you want. He sets his reed pen down and scratches his head, leaving a streak of soot across his temple. Most of it's handed off, either to Menka or one of the temple couriers. They bundle it with the other offerings and send it downstream. If it's clean and fragrant enough, it goes straight to the inner sanctum. If not, you raise your eyebrows. It ends up in the community offerings. He does air quotes with ink-stained fingers, which is a polite way of saying they use it to rub on statues, floor tiles, or possibly to bribe temple cats. Who knows? You laugh, but it's a little too believable. There's a lot of dignity in Egyptian ritual, but also a lot of practicality. If something smells nice and isn't cursed, odds are it's getting used. Historians still argue whether these temple collections were spiritually selective or just logistically efficient. Some say every oil offering was matched to a god's known preferences: cedar wood for Osiris, myrrh for Isis, cinnamon for Ra. Others suggest priests just made do with what came in, dabbing whatever they had on the appropriate deity with solemn enthusiasm, and very little actual sniff testing. But it's not just temples. Perfume taxes had a second life in trade. You see, Egypt didn't just use oils, they exported them. Frankincense from Punt, cedar from Lebanon, lotus from the marshes. These were big business. Collected taxes could be repackaged and sent off in caravans or ships, eventually traded for lapis, spices, even wine. In a way, your little contribution could be halfway to Cyprus by next month. Dadu must read your thoughts, because he says, "Don't get excited." Yours probably ends up with the floor scrubbers. "Gee, thanks," he shrugs. "Look, if you want it to go somewhere nice, make better oil." Touché. But this makes you think, what did make good oil? There wasn't a standardized scent profile, like a modern perfume counter. Instead, value came from rarity, purity, and association. If a blend was used in a famous festival or mentioned in a hymn, its price skyrocketed. One scribe's notes mention blue lotus oil of the 4th month, which supposedly evoked visions. Another records a shipment of blessed myrrh, thrice strained and cooled beneath moonlight, which sounds like something you'd buy on a dare. And there's another quirky detail. Containers mattered. You couldn't just dump your oil into any old jug. Presentation was part of the tax value. A well-sealed alabaster vial could double the perceived worth of a mediocre blend. It wasn't just perfume, it was performance. This explains the small fortune Dadu spends on reed string, wax stoppers, and discarded perfume jars he acquires from traveling merchants. He's not just writing down names. He's curating a sensorial inventory worthy of divine nostrils. You notice, too, the little habits of storage, how he separates the maybe usable oils from the definitely going to the gods ones. How he marks jars with colored dabs, ochre for myrrh, green for lotus, dark blue for unknowns. It's not temple protocol. It's just Dedu's system, a whole taxonomy of scent, written in smudges and intuition. And what about fakes, you ask, curious? Dedu groans. Don't get me started. Last season, I got a jar labeled Sun Oil of Raw that smelled like mashed barley and someone's uncle. You grin. So what did you do? He shrugs. Logged it. Menka was in a rush. You blink. That passed? The label was nice. Again, presentation. It's half the game. Still, you get the sense that Dedu's not just a tired bureaucrat. You pause by a low stone wall where some children are squatting, flicking pebbles and arguing over whose turn it is to chase the neighbor's goat. The morning heat hasn't quite thickened into a wall yet, but it's getting there. The Nile breeze has slowed to a lazy whisper, just enough to keep the dust suspended mid-air like a prophecy no one bothered to finish. You lean against the warm stone and glance back toward Dedu's house. Inside, he's no doubt still muttering about ink shortages and filing jars into their spiritual fates. But outside, you're surrounded by the actual stuff, the herbs, the resins, the petals that make up the lifeblood of this strange scented economy. And it is an economy, even if it sometimes feels like an elaborate game of divine show and smell. You crouch down, pick a bruised stalk of something pungent. It might be thyme, or possibly last week's discarded bouquet. Hard to tell. But here's the truth. Most people in your village aren't making perfume for fashion or pleasure. They're making it for survival. It's barter. It's bribe. It's obligation. And if you can make a scent strong enough or rare enough to catch a priest's interest or a tax collector's nose, you've just turned a jar of oily plants into something with actual power. That's why so many people experiment in makeshift stills, in broken pots, on the backs of cooking fires and under full moons. You once heard of a neighbor who used goat milk and myrrh. Another tried juniper, papyrus ash, and lizard eggs. That one cleared out an entire courtyard for 3 days. Historians still argue whether these rural blends influenced the major temple perfumes or were just ignored entirely. Some believe innovation trickled up, villagers creating strange mixtures that caught on with scribes or priests. Others claim temple recipes were locked tight, inherited, and enforced, with no room for goat milk surprise. Either way, it didn't stop the people from trying. You walk down toward the reed beds, where a few neighbors are collecting blue lotus blossoms in broad, shallow baskets. Their sleeves are rolled high, feet sunk in the warm muck, laughing and complaining in equal measure. One of them nods at you. "Trying again?" she calls out. "Your last batch smelled like sadness." "Thanks, Rana," you reply. "Yours smelled like old bread." She grins and flicks a damp reed at you. The air is thick with flower scent, sweat, and something vaguely citrusy. You breathe it all in, maybe too deeply. Because here's the thing most people forget. Ancient Egyptian perfumery wasn't just about petals and oils. It was about timing. Some plants had to be picked at dawn before they drooped. Others were useless unless dried. Some needed to be infused in a warm bath of oil and left under sunlight for days. Some had to be chanted over, if you believed the local temple apprentices. And yet, no one ever had a reliable recipe. You heard a story once of a priest who spent his entire life trying to recreate the oil of 7 winds, a blend described in a fraying scroll tucked in the back of a desert shrine. He died with nothing but a shelf of failures and a nose that never fully recovered. That's the other side of this world, the devotion. For all the jokes about smelly taxes and questionable jars, there's something sacred in the way people lean over their little fires, stirring oils and whispering prayers. Perfume wasn't just a commodity, it was a connection. To the gods, to the ancestors, to your hopes for better weather, better health, a kinder scribe. Even the tax process, ridiculous as it sounds, was a form of communication. You made your oil, you bottled it, you offered it, and you hoped that someone, somewhere, divine or bureaucratic, would say, yes, this counts. You shake the water from your fingers and walk the marsh path, back up toward the village. The sun is angling toward noon now, its heat bending the air in the distance. You pass Menka, your friendly, sunburnt tax collector, squatting beneath a woven awning, scribbling something on a shard of pottery. He looks up. Don't tell me you're experimenting again. You smile. Just researching. He snorts. That's what they all say. Until they bring me a jar of boiled onions and call it Ra's morning breath. Okay, that was one time. He waves you off. But there's no anger in it. Menka knows the system's strange. He's part of it. But he's also stuck enforcing rules that shift with scent, mood, and humidity. You nod toward his bowl of collected offerings. What's trending this week? He lifts the lid. Inside, 5 vials. One smells floral. One smells like burnt cinnamon. One is just labeled Hope. He shrugs. They're all acceptable, barely. I gave Dedu the worst one. You laugh and keep walking. Back home, you reach for your stash. Tiny clay jars, a cracked alabaster flask, a reed-wrapped bottle you inherited from your grandmother. You start lining them up on a mat, uncorking, sniffing me. You wake the next morning with a headache that smells faintly of saffron and regret. Someone in the neighborhood must have been testing a particularly potent batch overnight. You sit up, stretch your back, and accidentally knock over a jar of something sticky that you forgot to cork. It seeps into the reed mat with a slurp and releases a thick aroma of old figs and burnt myrtle. Not the worst way to start the day, but definitely not the best. Out in the courtyard, the air is already thick, not just with heat, but with the layered perfume of 100 ancient compromises. Every family within nose shot has their own recipe, their own method, their own theory about what makes something worthy of temple shelves or taxable ledgers. It's amazing, really, how much power floats in these little clouds of scent. You grab a scrap of cloth to dab your forehead and head off toward the central plaza. Well, plaza is generous. It's more like a packed earth intersection of intentions, but it's where everything happens. Goats, gossip, grain, and today, perfume weighing. Now here's the thing about value in ancient Egypt. It's slippery. Not just metaphorically, though it certainly was that too, but literally. Oils and perfumes don't behave like grain or livestock. You can't eyeball them in quite the same way. You can't jingle a jar and hear its worth. You have to smell it. You have to trust that what you're smelling is what it's supposed to be, which, naturally, leads to complications. Historians still argue whether there were standardized olfactory grades used across nomes, Egypt's districts, or if everything was left up to local officials. There are mentions of scribes being trained in scent differentiation, but no definitive guidebook survived. Just clay labels and the occasional sarcastic complaint on papyrus. You reach the scent weighing station where Menka stands with a priest from the nearby temple, a short man with a shaved head and an expression like someone just told him his incense is last season's blend. They're arguing in hushed tones. I'm telling you, the priest insists, this has too much cedar. It overpowers the frankincense. It's for tax, Menka says flatly, not a dinner party. You approach, holding your own offering in a small, polished dish, olive oil infused with something you're hoping smells like lotus, but might honestly be closer to damp bathhouse. The priest pinches a bit and rubs it between his fingers, sniffs, frowns, and then shrugs. It'll do, he mutters. And just like that, you're logged. But what happens after the weighing? That's the part no one ever really talks about. You step aside and watch as the jars, yours and several others, are collected into a woven basket and carried toward the temple by an assistant with surprisingly delicate hands, for someone also responsible for shooing stray cats. Because yes, these scents, collected, traded, and sniffed with judgmental precision, are heading into the temple's supply rooms. Some will be burned in rituals. Some will be used to anoint statues. Some will be sold back to the wealthy as sanctified blends. And some, let's be honest, will just sit there until they separate into layers of disappointment. Still, there's a system, a fragrant, flawed, semi-functional system, and part of that system involves you. You stroll behind the assistant, half curious. You've never really seen what happens inside those narrow temple chambers where the scent offerings end up, and you're not alone. Most people don't go in, unless you're a priest or a scribe, or one of those deeply mysterious inventory keepers who seem to exist only in corners in silence. But today, the assistant doesn't seem to mind the company. So you walk through the narrow passage, past a pair of half-carved limestone statues, and into a cool, dim room lined with shelves. This, you think, is the olfactory treasury. Rows and rows of tiny vessels, some sealed with wax, some open, their contents slowly thickening with age. There are perfumes here that probably haven't been touched since the last flood season, and there's a logic to it, a quiet alphabet of scent you don't fully understand. In one corner, a priest is measuring drops into shallow dishes, testing blends for rituals, one for dawn, one for funerals, one for blessing the new grain stores. Another dish sits alone, labeled simply, for cleansing the high priest's sandals. That's specificity. A cat slinks along the floor, its tail flicking near a bowl of what smells like roasted juniper and disappointment. It sneezes. You glance around, overwhelmed by the variety and the silence. This is where your contribution ends up, in a temple treasury of smells, one jar in a kingdom of scent. And suddenly, the whole thing feels bigger, less like bureaucracy, more like strange, sacred logistics. You turn to the assistant, who's placing your dish on a shelf labeled Untested, Tier 2. Not bad, you think. Could have been Tier.
You head back home with the sun climbing higher, sending golden slats across the packed dirt like it's trying to grill the day itself. Your tunic clings to your back, and your shoes, if you can still call them that, are now more dust than fabric. But at least the taxes are done. Well, the perfume part, anyway. Because, of course, Egypt didn't stop at scent. You're barely through your doorway when there's a thud outside, followed by the unmistakable bleating of an unhappy goat. Again. It's probably the neighbors, or yours. At this point, livestock boundaries are more of a polite suggestion than actual law. And yet, here's the kicker. That goat might end up part of someone's tax payment. You flop onto a low stool, splash some water onto your face from a clay basin, and start tallying in your head. What else do you owe this month? Taxes in ancient Egypt were impressively broad. Perfumes, yes. But also grain, linen, beer, honey, animals, labor. If it existed and could be carried, counted, or vaguely bartered, it probably got taxed. One of the more underappreciated elements. Time. Yep, time. You didn't always pay in things. Sometimes you paid in sweat. The state could ask you, or your sons, or your cousins, or literally anyone who looked strong enough, to haul bricks for a new granary, dredge irrigation canals, or stand watch at a granary gate while pigeons looked suspiciously judgmental. And here's a fun tidbit. The pharaoh's accountants kept tallies on palm fiber ropes, knots and tassels coded with meaning, which sounds weird until you realize modern spreadsheets aren't that different, just fewer splinters. Back in your house, the smell of not quite lotus oil still lingers in the air, mingling with reed dust and a faint undercurrent of donkey. You glance at a low shelf where you've tucked away a few jars, old tax payments, trade goods, bribes for the neighbor's kid to stop throwing pebbles at your roof. You know, essentials. Historians still argue whether the tax system was truly centralized or operated more like a federation of loosely coordinated scribes and collectors. Some evidence suggests each region had significant autonomy, especially in how taxes were assessed and valued. Other texts imply tighter control, with detailed quotas and expected yields down to the jar, but regardless of who ran the show, you were the one footing the bill, and the price could shift. Bad harvest? Expect a knock at your door anyway. Cattle plague? No one's waiving your incense dues. Still, it wasn't all hardship. Taxes also meant infrastructure. Grain silos, irrigation, roads. Well, dusty footpaths mostly, but still. Civilization, right? You think about your neighbor, the one with the goat. He paid last month in onions and dried dates. A bold move, considering onions were considered semi-sacred in some regions and vaguely insulting in others. One temple accepted them as offerings. Another banned them outright for making the priests too earthy. So much of this world is situational, relational. You don't just learn the rules, you learn who is enforcing them this week. Take Menka, for example. He's your local tax collector. Gruff, squinty, and always chewing something bitter-smelling. He can be generous if he likes your perfume, or if you catch him before noon. But get him on a bad day, like the time someone paid him with fish that had clearly been sun-warmed for several days, and suddenly he's tallying every grain in your basket like it's state gold. But it's not just Menka. Behind him is a sprawling network of bureaucrats, scribes, and temple officials. They write, count, adjust, and argue. And somewhere at the very top sits a high priest or royal official with a scroll so long it probably needs its own donkey. What makes all this work, barely, is the shared fiction that everyone knows the rules, even if, deep down, they don't. You step outside again and squint toward the horizon. A caravan is approaching, a slow shuffle of donkeys, carts, and sunburned travelers. Trade day. They're coming from the next village over, which means new goods, new rumors, and probably at least one perfume that smells suspiciously like last week's fish sauce. You head toward the market. The village square is busier now. Stalls made from patched cloth and palm fronds line the edges. A man sells crushed lotus paste wrapped in reed paper. A woman sharpens flint knives, while a boy beside her peddles blessed oil from an unlabeled jar. Someone's playing a lute-like instrument very badly. And then there's the whisper network, the real information stream. Oh, I heard Beckett tried to bribe the scribe with duck eggs. Someone submitted a perfume made from pressed riverweed. Did you hear the high priest mistook sesame oil for holy balm? He anointed the statue and everything. There's no printing press, no official gazette. This is how it spreads. Gossip and scent, word of mouth, passed between clay mugs of date beer and bowls of chickpea. You rise the next morning to the squawk of an ibis somewhere off near the water's edge, its cry cutting through the haze like a very opinionated reed flute. It's still early, just before the sun has fully lifted the chill from the ground, but your feet find the dirt path anyway. There's more to do, always more. Taxes are cyclical here in the land of sun and stone. They don't just come with the seasons, they are the seasons. And this morning, the air tastes like shomu, the harvest time, which for you means one thing: grain quotas. You pass others along the path, men with oxen carts laden with barley, women balancing baskets of emmer wheat on their heads, all of them moving in that slow, resigned rhythm of people fulfilling their civic duty, which also happens to weigh around 75 pounds. Because let's be honest, grain might be the most boring form of taxation, but it's also the most constant. Ancient Egypt was built on grain, literally. Bread fed the workers, beer kept them hydrated, and taxes on both kept the bureaucracy purring like a half-fed temple cat. You reach the threshing floor, a broad, circular patch of compacted earth, where officials are already at work with their measuring sticks and barked instructions. There's a wooden scale, a pile of sealed clay jars, and one very exasperated scribe perched on a stool, furiously scribbling into the rising sun. And here's where things get really fun. You see, they didn't just measure how much you brought, they measured how much you should have brought, based on land size, soil type, predicted flood levels from the last Nile inundation, and of course, whether you were known to misplace a few sacks along the way. Historians still argue whether these predicted quotas were reasonable estimates or bureaucratic guesswork turned power flex. Either way, it meant you were often guilty until proven not quite starving. And this is where the creative math began. That family with the slightly less fertile field. Adjust it down, the priest's cousin. Bump it up, the man who once publicly insulted the collector's sandals. Check again, he must have another stash. You unload your portion, careful to keep the grain tidy and the husks free of wormy surprises. A priest's aide inspects the haul, then nods. Good enough. You've done this before. Nearby, someone's trying to pass off mouldy lentils as rare vintage legume. The collector isn't buying it. Still, that kind of hustle is surprisingly common. After all, in a world without cash, taxes often came down to bartering, and bartering came down to creativity and desperation. Here's a fun fringe tidbit. In times of extreme shortage, people were known to pay in linen bandages, pottery shards, even crocodile eggs. Not legal tender exactly, but negotiable depending on how weird the week had been. You finish your business, collect your receipt, more like a wax-sealed marker token than a slip of paper, and step aside. There's a small crowd gathered around a woman selling pressed date cakes, spiced with cinnamon, and something else you can't quite place. Possibly clove, possibly regret. Either way, you buy one. It tastes like tax season. As you walk back, you pass a man muttering about papyrus thefts. Apparently, someone's been skimming scrolls from the temple archive and reselling them to wandering poets. Because if there's one thing Egypt's tax system teaches you, it's that everything is taxable. Even secrets. Back in your village, the streets are quieter. The morning bustle has given way to midday heat, and the goats, miraculously, are someone else's problem for once. You duck into the shade of a mud brick arch and pause, wiping your forehead with a scrap of linen. This whole cycle, this is the heart of the economy. No coins, no cards, just goods, sweat, scent, and scrolls. And speaking of scrolls, you head toward the temple. Not for worship this time, but to visit a man named Hapu, the archivist. If Dedu the scribe was all ink stains and sarcasm, Hapu is his opposite, austere, soft-spoken, and always suspiciously clean. The temple's cool inside, even during the harsh sun hours. Its sandstone columns stretch upward like fossilized tree trunks, carved with gods, festivals, and, of course, tax decrees. Some things deserve to be immortalized, apparently. Hapu greets you with a nod and an immediate correction on how you've tied your belt. Classic Hapu. You mention your grain payment and ask about this season's quotas. He shuffles through a stack of papyri with the solemnity of a man performing surgery. Finally, he hands you a scroll with faint red markings, predicted yields, rainfall variances, something about bird migration. Useful? You ask. Vaguely threatening, he replies. And that's tax culture in a nutshell. A blend of helpful data, implied scolding, and ink that smells like regret. As you leave, you pass the temple granaries, massive beehive-shaped structures with narrow slots at the top for puris. You don't mean to stop at the perfumer's stall, but honestly, how could you not? It sits tucked into a curve of the market square, shaded by fraying linen awnings and flanked by two enormous clay jars painted with faded lotus blossoms. The scent hits you before the sight does, a heady swirl of myrrh, juniper resin, crushed cinnamon bark, and something floral that refuses to be named. The perfumer, an older woman named Senti, gives you a nod like she's been expecting you, even though she definitely hasn't. She's wearing a wrap of saffron-dyed linen, and her fingers are stained from petals and pastes. She smells incredible. You smell like grain dust and bureaucracy. She gestures for you to come closer. You don't argue. The perfumes are arranged like a miniature treasure hoard. Tiny glass vials shaped like birds, alabaster pots sealed with beeswax, even hollow reeds filled with slow-dripping oil. Some sit on bronze trays, others nestle in soft scraps of linen. None are labeled, because of course not. Senti offers you one. You sniff. Rose? Number papyrus root? Maybe. Desperation and sandalwood? Almost definitely. You tell her you've just paid your perfume tax, and her laugh is like a puff of powdered cardamom. Ah, she says, tribute season. Perfume wasn't just luxury in ancient Egypt. It was economy, identity, even a kind of spiritual hygiene. Everyone wore it, from peasants to pharaohs. The wealthy layered scents like armor. The poor made do with crushed mint and burned date pits. And somewhere in between stood people like you, just trying to pass off a semi-decent oil blend as acceptable. But Senti knows the game. She asks what you paid in. You tell her, a modest jar of what might be lotus or might be fermented fig with delusions of grandeur. She winces politely. Next time, she says, try adding a pinch of cedar ash. Tricks the nose. Smells expensive. You nod, filing that away for future deception. Perfume taxes, like most taxes here, operate in that strange limbo between value and volume. It's not about how much you bring. It's how fancy it seems, which creates problems. Historians still argue whether ancient Egypt ever had a standardized system for scent valuation. Some say local temple officials relied on seasonal charts and import logs. Others suggest it came down to sniff tests and strong opinions. Either way, the whole setup was ripe for arguments and occasional fraud. Take, for instance, the infamous fish oil incident of a few years back. A merchant tried to pass off a concoction of dried roses steeped in pressed Nile perch fat. Claimed it was a Nubian aphrodisiac blend. The tax collector nearly vomited. The scribe wrote fraudulent in giant red letters. The merchant ended up selling pottery instead. Senti remembers it well. That man still owes me a new mixing bowl, she mutters. You ask how she makes her blends. She smiles and leads you behind the stall. There, tucked in a narrow courtyard, is a small stone press, a collection of glazed ceramic pots, and several bundles of dried herbs hanging from a reed lattice. It's like stepping into a potion maker's hideout. She walks you through her process, pressing blossoms, steeping roots in oil, straining the mixture through linen, aging it in the sun under bits of polished obsidian. It's equal parts chemistry, sorcery, and guesswork. And it's expensive, which is why perfume made such a good tax item. It was small, portable, and highly valuable, especially the good stuff. A single drop of imported myrrh could cost more than a whole goat. And goat perfume, by the way, is not a thing anyone wants to experience. You ask if she ever has trouble with tax collectors. She snorts. Trouble? Number conversations? Constantly. Apparently, some collectors are more generous if you slip them a free sample. Others insist on full measurements, pouring tiny droplets onto linen and waiting to see how long the scent lasts. If it fades too quickly, rejected. Too strong? Suspicious? Just right? Taxed at the highest bracket? Naturally. It's an art form, navigating this system. And Senti is a master. But not everyone is. Just last week, a traveller from up north tried to pay in a concoction of melted beeswax and crushed olives. Claimed it was medicinal. It smelled like feet. Dedu the scribe refused to even record it. That's the thing about perfume tax. You can fake quantity. You can't fake quality. Not for long, anyway. And yet, the perfumed economy continues. Because Egypt isn't just sand and stone. It's scent. The temples burn Kifi incense to call the gods. The dead are embalmed with fragrant oils. Even birth rituals involve scented poultices and herbs tucked behind the ears. You thank Senti for the lesson, and the small clay sample pot she insists you take, and step back into the market. The sun's higher now, and everything's sharper. Voices louder, carts busier, shade harder to find. But your nose is full of frankincense and spikenard, and for a moment you wander a little longer, letting your feet choose where to go, while your brain soaks in everything it just learned about cedar ash and olfactory deception. Eventually, your sandals crunch to a halt on the edge of the riverbank, where civilization thins out and the Nile takes over. You find a rock that's flat enough to sit on and settle there with a contented sigh. The perfumer's gift is still tucked into your pouch, giving off a faint aroma every time you shift. You're officially logged, taxed, and perfumed. And yet, your curiosity is far from done. Because it's one thing to pay the tax, but who, exactly, decided that perfume should be taxed? Who makes those rules? Who ensures that half a clay jar of iffy myrrh equals your monthly obligation to the crown? Enter the temple-state system, bureaucratic, divine, occasionally confusing, and absolutely in charge. Ancient Egypt wasn't a secular operation. Religion and governance were a braided cord, inseparable from each other. The temples weren't just places of worship. They were economic hubs, administrative centers, and warehouses of scented tribute. If you've ever wondered how a high priest of Thoth could also be your local tax auditor, well, this is that era. Most perfume taxes, especially the fancier oils, went to temples. Not because the gods demanded to smell nice, though let's be honest, they probably appreciated it, but because temples acted like massive bureaucratic machines. They had staff, ledgers, scribes, storage rooms, the works. And yes, sometimes those scribes doubled as priests or tax officials, or both. Historians still argue whether this overlap was a deliberate way to centralize power or just a byproduct of trying to make an economy work in a society where your highest authority was also your divine mascot. Either way, the temples didn't just collect offerings. They assessed them, taxed them, and redistributed them. So that vial of your maybe lotus oil? There's a good chance it's now sitting in a sealed alcove behind a limestone wall, beside jars of incense, bundles of flax, and one very confused goose that someone paid in last week. Goose offerings, Apparently, still a thing. Back on your rock, you watch a barge drift by, piled high with grain and clay pots. A crew of shirtless workers pole it forward, shouting to each other over the lap of water. You wonder how many of those pots are filled with oil, and how many will be sniffed, tested, and taxed before the sun goes down. You remember what Dedu said, the scribe with the ink-stained hands and permanent frown? I write it down. That's the job. Not judging, not weighing, just logging. The scribe is the mind. The tax collector is the hand. The temple is the stomach that eats it all. This layered system was how Egypt functioned. Pharaohs may have ruled from the top, but it was the temple scribes who made sure the gears didn't jam. Without them, the empire wouldn't know who owed what, which jars had already been counted, or whether the last 5 vials of perfume were real or fermented fig water with a superiority complex. You think of that shrine in Dedu's house, the one tucked into the shadow of his scroll cabinet. Thoth, ibis-headed, pen-holding, patron of wisdom and bureaucracy. Dedu had dabbed a bit of perfume on the altar, hoping, maybe, for divine patience in the face of another mislabeled vial. It's almost comforting, knowing even the tax people pray for help. But this divine bureaucratic mashup wasn't just local. It extended across the kingdom. Each region had its own temple complex. Each complex had scribes, collectors, guards, and a few people whose only job was to smell things and nod thoughtfully. Okay, maybe not only that job, but close. These temples formed a network, a fragrant, deeply organized web of taxation and tribute. Oils flowed from households to temples to royal coffers, sometimes traded again for grain or tools or services. Perfume was currency, sacrament, and admin headache, all rolled into one. And somewhere in that labyrinthine network, your not quite lotus oil is now a ledger entry. You smile at the thought. Then you hear the soft plunk of something dropping into the water. You turn to see a young boy, a temple runner, judging by his braided sash, pouring a thin stream of liquid from a clay jug into the Nile. A ritual, maybe, or a disposal, or a little of both. The scent wafts toward you, heavy with frankincense, too strong for everyday use. You cough lightly. The boy grins and runs off. Ritual purity mattered here. Scents weren't just for pleasure. They were used to mark transitions, ward off disease, honor the gods. The line between religious offering and taxable good? Blurred at best. The same jar might bless a body at a funeral and earn a scribe's squiggle on a tax scroll. The sun is sinking now, casting amber light across the water and turning the reed banks to bronze. You stretch, your limbs stiff from sitting. Time to head home. As you walk,
you wake the next morning with the scent of not quite lotus still clinging to your tunic like yesterday's dreams. Half sweet, half questionable. Stretching your arms, you sit up on your woven mat and blink into the soft, dusty light filtering through your reed shutters. Another day in Egypt, another chance to be taxed creatively. As you shuffle to the courtyard, the usual morning sounds reach your ears. Goats bleating somewhere entirely too close to your kitchen, the rhythmic pounding of laundry against stone slabs, and faintly, the metallic echo of a pot dropped in irritation. All around you, people are waking up to lives filled with farming, bargaining, building, and yes, scenting. Today, your neighbor is boiling something pungent in a copper pot. You're not sure whether it's perfume, dye, or soup. With the right ingredients, it could be all three. It's a reminder that in ancient Egypt, the line between home and workshop was porous. Many families made perfumes in-house, literally. The process could be a family trade, passed down like stories or bread recipes. Fragrant oils weren't just luxury, they were livelihood. And taxation followed the scent like bees to honey. This is where things got interesting. The state taxed perfume because it had value. Not just economic value, but ritual, medicinal, and even magical value. You couldn't walk 10 paces in any direction without stumbling across some use for scented oil, whether it was for embalming, healing, seduction, or making sure you didn't smell like the Nile at low tide, but tracking that value. Whole different animal. You head to the market again, because today you've decided to learn more about how people determined what a perfume was worth. Was it the origin of the ingredients, the prestige of the blender, the smell, all of the above? You spot a vendor whose stand is practically drowning in tiny glass and alabaster vials. He's rubbing his fingers together like he's just handled something rare, and judging by the gold-tinged oil on his nails, maybe he has. You ask him how he prices his wares. He shrugs and says, if the priest's wife likes it, it's expensive. Honesty, you respect that. There was no unified grading system in ancient Egypt for perfume. Unlike grain, which had standardized measures, or textiles, which could be weighed and counted, scent was subjective, squishy, prone to lies and exaggeration, and perfect for creative tax avoidance. Historians still argue whether tax collectors were trained in scent discernment, or whether they simply made educated guesses, or not so educated ones. Some may have relied on local gossip, or the reputations of certain vendors. Others may have taken bribes in the form of sample vials, which somehow didn't make it into the ledgers. One tax scroll actually included a note that translated roughly to, seems fishy, marked for priest review. You have to imagine that scribe's expression as they sniffed a suspicious vial of sacred rose and caught a whiff of crushed lentils instead. The lack of standardization led to a game of fragrant roulette. Vendors might exaggerate the rarity of their ingredients. Buyers might water down oils before handing them over to collectors. One recorded case involved someone presenting frankincense extract that turned out to be pine sap and donkey sweat. Charming. You wander past a few more stalls and see a woman carefully pouring amber liquid into tiny clay containers, sealing them with linen stoppers. She tells you this batch contains safflower oil infused with spikenard and hints of citrus peel. It's for a temple offering. She hopes it's worthy. You ask what happens if it's not. She gives a tired look and says, they keep it anyway. So even unworthy perfumes could still be claimed. That's the power of bureaucracy. The gods might not be impressed, but the tax agents, they had quotas. Some towns even had unwritten hierarchies. Who was known to sell the real stuff, and who was known for making cheap blends smell fancier by heating them over cedar coals or storing them in reused alabaster jars. The tricks of the trade weren't new. They were simply ancient. You return to Dedu's house, curiosity still burning. He's hunched as usual, ink on his elbow, reed pen twitching like a nervous insect. You ask him, how do you know what something's worth? He blinks slowly and replies, I don't. I ask Menka. If he shrugs, I guess. Menka the collector. You've heard of him. Known for his magnificent mustache and suspicious tolerance of experimental scents. He once accepted a half jar of geranium oil mixed with dried barley as ritual grade. No one's quite sure what that means. It's here you realize. Value was less science and more community consensus. If enough people believed something was high grade, it was. If someone had enough influence, their perfume magically gained worth. And if someone tried to cheat the system too obviously, They might face penalties, or worse.
You wake to the gentle creak of reeds swaying in the breeze, and for once, no goats. A miracle. Or maybe someone finally fixed that section of fencing. Either way, it's a good omen. The air is cooler this morning, with a sharpness that makes the tips of your fingers tingle as you unlatch the wooden shutter. Out in the distance, the Nile glistens under a blanket of mist, like the world is still deciding whether it's morning or not. And you? You're already up, turning over the same question that's probably haunted every perfume-producing taxpayer since the First Dynasty. Did I offer enough? Enough oil? Enough quality? Enough effort? Because the truth is, in ancient Egypt, value wasn't always in the eye of the beholder. Sometimes it was in the nose of a grumpy official who hadn't slept, hadn't bathed, and was about 2 vials away from outlawing lavender altogether. You run your hands over the stone rim of a storage jar, feeling the gritty residue left by old oil and sand. You'd meant to clean it days ago. Now it's just another part of the landscape, much like perfume taxation. Somewhere nearby, a tax scribe is waking too, probably groaning at the thought of another day of deciphering symbols like cracked almond oil, possibly edible, and gift from aunt, not for resale. It's a thankless job, but someone has to log your neighbor's sandalwood obsession. Historians still argue whether scribes and collectors were genuinely reviled or just viewed as part of life's background noise, like mosquitoes or chipped cups or dramatic cousins. Evidence from household letters suggests a mix of dread, respect, and passive-aggressive compliance. In other words, nothing's really changed. You head down the path, sandals scuffing the packed earth toward the temple district. No, not to offer anything. You've done your civic duty. But because something's always happening there, and gossip flows more freely when surrounded by incense. And it's worth remembering, temples weren't just religious sites. They were hubs of economic activity, community planning, bureaucratic filing, and of course, perfumery. Monks didn't just chant, they blended oils. Priests didn't only preach, they evaluated taxes, and a few of them. They made bank on sandalwood resale. One particularly famous temple archive, uncovered at Karnak, included detailed records of perfume ingredient shipments from across the empire, down to how many days the camels took. Imagine the spreadsheet stress when a shipment of cinnamon resin was late and the festival of Osiris was 3 days out. You overhear 2 women in saffron tunics arguing softly by the temple gates. One is holding a small clay jar and gesturing animatedly. The other is shrugging in a way that says, "Don't blame me, blame the inspector." You catch the word coriander and something that sounds like snake pit quality. Perfume politics. As you move along the outer walls, you pass murals showing offerings to various gods. It's almost comforting, among all the gold, wine, bread, and birds. There's always someone pouring oil from a tilted jar, letting it drip like sacred honey. The offering is always graceful, always elegant, always probably taxed at 15%. There's a section of the wall that depicts Thoth, god of wisdom and writing, holding a scroll with neat black lines. You can almost imagine him sighing and muttering, "Someone misspelled frankincense again." But here's a strange twist. Perfume wasn't just offered. It was also worn by statues. Yes, that's right. The divine statues of gods were not left to languish scentless. Priests would rub them with sacred oils, dress them, feed them symbolic meals, and sometimes even sing lullabies. The gods, it seems, liked luxury, or maybe they just had demanding skincare routines. You wander into a shaded courtyard, the kind of place where older scribes come to eat flatbread and pretend their backs don't hurt. One of them, an especially creaky man with indigo cuffs stained in something that smells like garlic and roses, is dabbing oil onto a reed and holding it up to the sunlight. He gives you a look. Safflower. Probably, he says. Probably, you ask. He shrugs. Could be mustard. Reassuring. You sit near the edge of the courtyard, listening to the sounds of temple life. Chisel strikes from a carving apprentice. Soft chants from the sanctuary. A goat bleating somewhere it probably shouldn't be. Again. It's moments like these you realize how much scent defines the atmosphere of Egypt. Even the architecture seems to anticipate it. Broad open spaces for airflow, narrow incense corridors, stone basins for washing scented oils from hands and feet. The very layout of temples and homes reflected olfactory logic. And despite the bureaucratic burden, Egyptians genuinely loved their fragrances. Recipes have been found carved into walls, hidden in scrolls, passed down between generations. One blend, known simply as kaifi, contained over 16 ingredients, or you make your way home slowly, the scent of saffron and fish oil still clinging to your tunic like a sleepy whisper from the gods. The sun dips lower, casting bronze shadows across the walls of mud-brick houses, their reed doors fluttering in the evening breeze. Life here has its rhythms, and the perfume tax is just one note in the grand, strange melody of ancient Egyptian existence. You pause at a vendor's stand where someone's burning something fragrant in a dish of hot coals. It's sharp and herbal, maybe mint or crushed papyrus stems. You breathe it in and let it blur your thoughts just a little, because after a whole day of watching oil-dripped scrolls and watching men argue about lotus versus fig, you've earned a brief olfactory detour. Back in your courtyard, your neighbor's goats are back, as if summoned by fate or their own bizarre internal compass. You wave one off with a sleepy flick of the wrist and it blinks at you like it's offended. And maybe it is. You're not in the mood to negotiate with livestock right now. Instead, you duck into your little house, and once again, that comforting mix of old scrolls, dust, and warm lamp oil greets you like an old friend with terrible hygiene. The world inside is smaller, but it makes more sense. One jar, one record, one transaction at a time. You sit, unstopper your taxed, though questionably genuine, lotus oil, and dab a drop onto a bit of linen. The scent is weak now, but pleasant and oddly calming. You smile faintly, thinking of Dedu the scribe rolling his eyes at your offering and muttering about suspiciously floral goose fat. Still, he wrote it down. That's what mattered, because at its core, the perfume tax system was less about enforcing fairness and more about recording participation. You showed up. You offered something. Someone sniffed it and decided it counted. There's something weirdly reassuring about that. Historians still argue whether this whole perfume economy was more symbolic than functional. Some say it allowed elites to reinforce social control. If you could regulate the air people breathed, you could regulate everything. Others argue it was a practical way to collect value from perishable goods, especially in a society where money wasn't yet coins but goods and barter. But maybe it was both. A ritual and a rule book. A nose-based bureaucracy built on human instinct and ritual obligation, and somewhere between temple rituals and Dedu's ink-stained tax logs, it all stayed afloat. You glance over at your little shrine to Thoth in the corner, much humbler than the one in Dedu's house, but still there. A tiny offering sits beneath it, a chip of resin and a folded bit of fabric. You're not even sure what's on it anymore. Something vaguely lemony? You made the offering weeks ago, but Thoth hasn't complained. Outside, the sounds of the night market begin to pick up. Soft flutes, laughter, the unmistakable clang of someone dropping a pot. You wonder if that's the same pot someone tried to pass off as a perfume container last month. Smells like olives, Dedu had said. Not even good olives. It's funny how much power scent has. Not just to tax or to trade, but to trigger memory. The way a certain blend can bring back a market day from 10 years ago, or a morning offering made while the Nile fog still clung to the fields like wet linen. You think of the time someone tried to sneak past the tax agents by hiding a vial inside a loaf of bread. It worked until the bread started leaking. Then there was the man who claimed his oil had been kissed by Ra himself. Turned out to be crushed, marigold steeped in donkey sweat. Dedu almost fainted. You did too. These little stories are the ones that stick, and that's maybe the best part of it all, the fact that the record keepers were also the storytellers, that the mundane act of cataloguing a jar of mystery goo could become the seed of a tale passed down generations, that the perfume tax, of all things, became a kind of folklore, equal parts economy and absurdity. You light your lamp. The oil crackles gently, and the room glows with that soft orange that makes everything look just a bit more magical than it is. Your scroll from today lies on the shelf, tied neatly, logged officially, and already starting to curl at the edges. Another month complete. Another scent tested, taxed, and maybe even appreciated. And in a world where so much fades, from memory, from stone, from scent itself, that tiny act of writing it down, that's immortality, at least until someone spills cinnamon oil on the record.